Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph.
That's the Mishnah.
At the top Mishnah. And there are some sheets actually. Nothing fancy, but if you could just, there are some sheets out there on the table. If you don't have one, then please ask one in the middle. Okay. I always say there's two advantages of the 8:30 Daf Yomi, or the 8:20 Daf Yomi. First of all, you already did it once. Saying, well, it seems like this crowd's a little bit less tough on me over here. Okay. So we went through everything this morning sometimes. Okay.
This crowd is less what?
Nothing. Mishnah. Start the tape again. Okay. Mishnah. Shnei achin nisuin shtei achayos umeis echad mehen v'achar kach meisa ishto shel sheni. So you had two brothers. Let's look at the top of the chart. Again, it's not fancy, but you had two brothers who were married to two sisters. So you have Ashes Shimon and Ashes Ruvain are sisters, and you have Ruvain and Shimon are brothers. Umeis echad mehen, and one of them died. So we crossed off, let's say, Ruvain on the second line. V'achach meisa ishto shel sheni. Then Shimon's wife died. Harezo asura olamis. So theoretically, one would say that maybe Shimon can marry Ashes Ruvain. Because again, Shimon couldn't marry Ashes Reuven before, because why? Because she was his wife's sister. But now that Reuven is gone, maybe Shimon should be able to marry Ashes Reuven. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, no, she's also to marry him. Why? Hoil v'nesra alav sha'achas. Because there was a time when Ashes Reuven couldn't marry Shimon. When was that? When Ashes Shimon was alive. But not just that, there was a time within Yibum that he couldn't marry. It's not just that he couldn't marry her, because in general, when your wife passes away, you're allowed to marry her sister after she dies. So the issue is not that Ashes Shimon dies now, because if it was just a case of Ashes Shimon dying, then Shimon should be able to marry Ashes Ruvain. The problem is that when Ruvain originally died, and Ashes Ruvain fell to Shimon as part of a Yibum process, so in that situation, Shimon couldn't marry Ashes Ruvain. Why? Because it was his wife's sister at the time. And now, even though in a regular case, when the wife dies, when Ashes Shimon dies, so Shimon should be able to marry Ashes Reuven. Since there was a time when Ashes Reuven was usher to him, i.e. when Reuven died, because his wife was still alive, so Ashes Reuven becomes usher and remains usher to Shimon, even after everything seems to be in the clear. Okay? Good. Pshita. The problem is that this is obvious. Well, it's not too obvious, but it's obvious because we have another Mishnah which we learned a few blot earlier, which is a little bit more complicated than this case, and we already learned this idea. What? Hashta umahasam delo midche mehai beisa legamre amarta lo. Hacha dika midche mehai beisa legamre lo kol shekain. What's the case? So let's look at Rashi. Pshita. La'el, on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, Gabe Shlosha Achim. It's a similar case where you have Shimon and Ruvain, but now if you look under that line, you have Levi involved as well. So Shlosha Achim, Shnai Mehem Nesuin Shtei Achayos, Ve'echad Nasa Nachris. And one of them married a Nachris, not a literal Nachris, but now related to Ashes Shimon and Ashes Ruvain. So those are sisters, and then you have Ashes Levi in the picture. Umeis Echad Mibale Achayos. Now one of them died, so let's say Shimon died. V'kanas nasoy nachris as ishto. Now Reuven couldn't marry Shimon's wife because it's his wife's sister, but Levi can marry Shimon's wife. So Levi, who's married to Ashes Levi, so that's her name. So Levi marries Ashes Shimon now. Okay. Umeisa ishto shel sheni. And now Ashes Reuven dies. V'achar kach meis nasoy nachris, and then Levi dies. Harezo asura alav olamis mishum Ashes ach. So now Ashes Shimon again, who was first married to Shimon and then was now married to Levi, and now Levi dies, so Ashes Shimon is available, and Reuven is no longer married to Ashes Reuven because she's dead. So theoretically, Reuven should be able to marry Ashes Shimon because what? It's his wife's sister, but his wife is no longer alive. However, since when Shimon originally died, Reuven couldn't marry Ashes Shimon because Reuven's wife was still alive. So therefore, since it was also to him once, it's also to him even now when everybody else is out of the picture. Now the difference there is, says the Gemara, there it's even more of a chiddush. Why? Because over there she never left the family. Because even after Shimon died, where did Eshes Shimon go? She married the other brother Levi. She stayed in the family, and yet you told me that even if she stays in the family the whole time, when everybody ends up dying, Reuven cannot marry Eshes Shimon, which is also Eshes Levi. He can't marry her, even though she stayed in the family the whole time. Why? Because originally when Shimon died, Reuven was usher to marry Eshes Shimon because it was his wife's sister at the time. So then over there, if that's going to be the case, so then Kal Vachomer in our case, when you go back to the top, where when Reuven died, Eshes Reuven, who couldn't marry Shimon because Eshes Shimon was still alive, Eshes Reuven was theoretically able to go to the marketplace and marry anybody. Kal Vachomer, now that Eshes Shimon dies, Shimon can't marry her because she was already out of the family. That's the Gemara's question. We already know this Chiddush from somewhere else, and it's not even that we know it from somewhere else. We know it from somewhere else. And Kal Vachomer, in this case, that if she stayed in the family, we said she still can't marry Shimon after everybody else dies. So clearly, when she is able to quote-unquote leave the family beforehand, and now she's able to marry Shimon theoretically, so obviously she's not going to be able to marry Shimon, right? So I think it's pretty clear. The second line, if the second one is true, then obviously the top is true as well. So the question is, why do you need our Mishnah once you have the Mishnah on Lamed Amud Aleph? So the Gemara says something very interesting. Tana hatana bereisha. No. So our Mishnah over here on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph was actually taught first. Okay. And originally the Gemara felt that the case that we just mentioned with Levi, Shimon was actually allowed to marry Eshes. Reuven was allowed to marry Eshes Shimon and Eshes Levi after everyone else died. Why? I just made it a little bit confusing because I crossed out Reuven died in the first case, Shimon died in the second, but it's the same exact thing. But originally we thought that in the second case, in fact, Reuven is allowed to marry Eshes Levi and Eshes Shimon after the fact because she stayed in the family the whole time. And therefore we needed our Mishnah to tell us that in the case where she doesn't stay in the family the whole time, in that case, now that everybody's dead, Reuven cannot marry Eshes Shimon. But what happened? Then the Gemara changed its mind. And then the Gemara said, no, even in the case of Levi, after everything is said and done, even though she remained in the family, Lamaisa now, since there was a time when Eshes Shimon was usher to Reuven, so Lamaisa now she's going to be usher as well. And once we had this fancy case where Levi was involved, and that was a chiddush, and even though she remained in the family, she's still usher to Reuven forever. So we're going to put that one first on Lamed Amud Aleph. But what do we do now with the one that we already had on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, which is not as big of a chiddush anymore, which is obvious now? We're not going to throw it out because it's a Mishnah. So what do we do? That one. But we're not going to go and get rid of this one. But you're right. At the end of the day, the Gemara says, at this point, once you have the Mishnah on Lamed Amud Aleph, telling me that when Levi married Eshes Shimon after Shimon died, and then Levi dies, and now all that's left is Reuven and Eshes Shimon. Reuven cannot marry Eshes Shimon even though she stayed in the family the whole time. Once you have that Mishnah on Lamed Amud Aleph, you do not need this Mishnah on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, because it's obvious that if Reuven and Shimon are brothers, and Eshes Reuven and Eshes Shimon are sisters, and now this one dies, it's obvious that if she left the family, then when she stayed in the family, she couldn't marry Shimon. Obviously, she can't marry him now either. Says the Gemara, no, since we had this originally, we're not going to throw it out. But you're right, we don't really need our Mishnah on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph anymore once we have the Mishnah on Lamed Amud Aleph.
Didn't we learn originally that the original Zika is never stops, goes to the Olam. Right? Okay. So, I mean, regardless of all these permutations of who she marries in between, that original Zika was there, and therefore if her sister was married at the time, she's
so that's what the Gemara is coming out by saying.
But I'm saying, didn't we already have, I mean, we learned it. That's what I'm saying. We already learned that Zika, not like a get, where the get stops it, right?
Interesting. So maybe that's based already knowing these Mishnayos, right? In Achanami. But that's what the Gemara is saying. Okay. Who said Yevamos is hard? Man, we always have these cases. Tana Rabbanan. I'm just joking. Tana Rabbanan. Last time I said that in the earlier show, then I got confused in the next case. Tana Rabbanan. Ba'aleha. Chayav aleha mishum eshes ach umishum achos isha. So what's this case? Ba'aleha, Rashi says, bechaye ishto. So you have the case where he was ba'aleha bechaye ishto. So you have the bottom case where Reuven actually came. So let's just say for our case, cross out Shimon over here on the bottom case. Right? Let's cross out Shimon. He dies. But now Reuven's still married to Eshes Reuven, and Eshes Shimon is the sister. So theoretically, Eshes Shimon should fall to Reuven in Yibum, but she can't because he's still married to Reuven. It's his wife's sister. So the question is, what happens if he marries her anyway? Or it's not considered marriage. What happens if he's Baala? What happens if he has Bia with her? So he gets punished. But what's he going to get punished for? Well, let's think about it for a second. What is she? First of all, she is Eishes Ach. She's the wife of his brother, because again, that doesn't fall off, because you're only allowed to marry Eishes Ach even after he dies. You can't marry Eishes Ach unless it's for Yibum. So she still has an Isser of Eishes Ach, being the wife of Reuven's brother, even though Shimon's dead now, because again, she can't marry him. He can't marry her. And she also has the Isser of what? Of Achos Isha. Don't say sister-in-law, because it's the same thing. But she has both Isurim. She has the Isser that it's his wife's sister, and she also has the Isser that it's his brother's wife. Not in Yaakov Yibum. He's dead, but if you can't take him in Yibum, then he's usher to you. Right? In a case where...
You can't take him in Yibum because of being his wife's sister, not because of Eishes Ach.
Well, once you can't take him in Yibum because it's your wife's sister, what Isser is there? The Isser, if you do take her, you're going to be over both Isurim, he says. Because she's still usher to you as Eishes Ach. You're right that theoretically Yibum should come and say you can marry her anyway, but since she's quote-unquote off-limits to you for a separate reason, she's still going to be off-limits to you als Eishes Ach. So there's basically two prohibitions of this woman right now. She's your brother's wife. One second, you'll see in a second. She's your brother's wife, and she's also your wife's sister.
So once the wife's sister negates her, we already have an halacha you can't marry your brother's wife.
So we're going to see. So this is what the Gemara is going to talk about now, whether we say Isser Chalal Isser or not. Whether we say that once you have one prohibition, another prohibition can come on top of that or not. And we'll see, it depends on who got married first.
But the only reason that one prohibition exists is because of the other.
No, the prohibition exists irrespective. Before Shimon dies,
one
second, before Shimon dies, why can't Reuven marry Esha Shimon?
Because of the sisters.
Two reasons. And if they weren't sisters? Still couldn't marry her.
No, when Shimon's alive, he couldn't. But
when Shimon's alive,
if they're not sisters.
Okay, but
Shimon dies.
When Shimon is alive, why can't Reuven marry Esha Shimon? For two reasons: A, because it's his wife's sister, and B, because it's his brother's wife. And if either one of them wasn't there, the other one would still be there.
Correct.
So, but you have to. It's correct, but that's the basis. So once you take Shimon out of the picture, we don't get rid of the Yisurim. It's not the bottom line is that if he can't do Yibum with her, so then that Isser of Eishes Ach still stays. I agree with you that if you needed to bring a new Isser, and that's what the Gemara is going to discuss, if you have to bring a new Isser on top of something else, you're right. What do you mean? She's already Isser. But at the end of the day, these two Isurim were already Chal beforehand. Now when Shimon dies, unless you can prove to me that the Isser of Eishes Ach no longer applies, i.e. by doing Yibum, then it's still in place. So right now you have two Isurim that are in place.
The only point is, if you change the case by saying they're not sisters now, and when Shimon dies, then Reuven could marry Shimon's wife.
Correct.
Because, for Yibum.
Correct.
So that point of Eishes Ach doesn't really exist other than the fact that they're sisters.
But it existed before, so to say now that it's just going to drop off when he dies because there's another reason, you're right. If there was no Isser, it wouldn't necessarily come and be added, but since it's already there, we just can't drop it because we still have this other thing that's connecting it. But we'll see in the Gemara. The Gemara is going to make it, Gemara will try to make it clear. So the Gemara says, so that's Rabbi Yossi. So you don't like Rabbi Yossi so much. Rabbi Yossi says that you're chayav for both. Rabbi Shimon says what? Rabbi Shimon Omer Eino chayav ela mishum eishes ach bevad. So you definitely don't like Rabbi Shimon because if anything you would like the other one. Rabbi Shimon says you're only chayav for eishes ach. You're not even chayav for achos isha. Now that's hard to hear, especially the way that you're arguing. V'hatanya, but it gets even worse. Rabbi Shimon Omer Eino chayav ela mishum achos isha bilvad. Rabbi Shimon says you're only chayav for achos isha. First of all, we have a contradiction within Rabbi Shimon. So again, Rabbi Yossi says if you go with Eishes Shimon after Shimon dies, you're chayav for both. Rabbi Shimon says you're chayav one. Which one? Well, it depends which day you asked him. One day he told you one day he told the other. So how do we understand this? So Gemara says, Lo kasha. We don't have a problem within Rabbi Shimon now. How did he contradict himself? He didn't. Kan shenasa chai v'achar kach nasa meis. Well, it depends which happened first. Depends if Shimon got married first or Reuven got married first. Well, who's chai? Well, we said Shimon died, so now Reuven's chai. So kan shenasa chai if Reuven gets married first, so what happens if Reuven gets married first? So now Reuven's married to Ashes Reuven in our picture. What is the Isser of Ashes Shimon to Reuven? It's his wife's sister. Later, when Shimon marries Ashes Shimon, so now Ashes Shimon not only becomes his wife's sister, it becomes his brother's wife. But which one came first? His wife's sister. So when he says that you're chayav for your wife's sister, that's when Reuven got married first. Whichever one was chal first, we say ein iser chal al iser. When Shimon then marries this woman who happens to be his brother's wife's sister, which is fine. But when Shimon marries this woman, Ashes Shimon, so now the iser of your brother's wife is not going to be chal, because at the end of the day, she's already usher to you as your wife's sister. Good? Clear. That's the case where he says, Eshes Ach. Khan, when does he hold that you're chayav for, that's when he says, Achos Isha. When did he say you're chayav for Eshes Ach? Khan Shenasa Meis, when Shimon marries first. So Shimon married Eshes Shimon. So now Eshes Shimon is usher to Reuven. Why? For only one reason, because it's his brother's wife. What happens? Now when Reuven marries Ashes Reuven, so now Ashes Shimon also theoretically should become usher to him as his wife's sister, but it doesn't, because according to Rabbi Shimon again, we're saying Ein Isser Chal al Isser, and once you have one Isser, the second one's not Chal. And therefore, again, we saw the two different cases, and that's why he contradicts himself. He's not contradicting himself. He's saying that there's two different possibilities. Depending on who gets married first, that's which Isser will be Chal first. Whichever Isser is Chal first, that's the one that he'll be Chayav for if he violates the Isser, but the second one will never be Chal. For Rabbi Shimon, so the Gemara asks a very fascinating question. For Rabbi Shimon, Heicha de Nasa Meis, V'achar Kach Nasa Chai. So now let's go back to the case. He says, Rabbi, okay, you explain me Rabbi Shimon, very nice. There's only one problem. What happens if Shimon gets married first? So what did we say if Shimon gets married first on the bottom picture? So what happens to Ashes Shimon vis-a-vis Reuven? Why is Ashes Shimon usher to Reuven? It's his brother's wife. What happens when Reuven marries Ashes Reuven? What happens to Ashes Shimon? She's still only usher to Reuven what? Alts? Eshes Ach. The Isser of Achos Isha, we say, is never Chal, because there's already one Isser. So what is the Gemara going to ask? An obvious question. So why are you telling me that the halacha is that they don't do Yibum because of Achos Isha? At the end of the day, the halacha shehem should be that you do Yibum like any other case. There's only one Isser that was Chal. The original Isser, in that case, when Shimon dies, Reuven should do Yibum on Ashes Shimon, even though it happens to be his wife's sister. Because at the end of the day, we just said that according to Rabbi Shimon, Ein Isser Chal al Isser. And when Reuven married his wife, the Isser of Ashes Shimon being his wife's sister was not Chal, because she was already usher to him else being his brother's wife. Great question in the Gemara. For Rabbi Shimon Heicha, only in that case. De nasa meis v'achach nasa chai, kevan de isra achos isha lo chayil. Since the isra of achos isha should not be chayil, because again, there was already an isra of your brother's wife, tit yabeim yevume, and we know that that's not the case. So how do we answer that? So we pull out a slick answer. Amar Rav Ashi, isra achos isha misla tali v'kai. You're right. He holds ein isra chal al isra. And when Shimon married Ashes Shimon, so the Isser to Reuven of Ashes Shimon was his brother's wife. So really they should be able to do Yibum. But Reuven later married Ashes Reuven. But the Isser wasn't Chal of Ashes Shimon now becoming his wife's sister, because again he was already Usser to her Alts, his brother's wife. Yeah, but it's hanging out there in the air. And it's getting ready to jump on at any time. So you're right, it wasn't Chal at the time, but it's still there. We can't ignore it. And therefore what? Ipaka Isser Ashes Ach, as soon as Shimon dies, and now the Isser of Ashes Ach is theoretically gone because now he should be doing Yibum, Asi Isser Achos Isha V'chayil. It's there, but it's not there. It wasn't Chal, but it's there enough that if you theoretically would have a case of Yibum, we're not going to let you do Yibum because she's your wife's sister.
Because if he marries
One second. Let's just read. So that's very interesting. So what the Gemara is basically saying, then we'll take the question. The Gemara is basically saying is you're right. Really, in theory, the way you're explaining it, Reuven should do Yibum with Ashes Shimon, because the only Isser that was Chal of Ashes Shimon was his brother's wife. When his brother dies, he should be able to do it. But since this Isser, which we weren't going to let be Chal, of his wife's sister, is sort of out there, up in the air, waiting to like jump on you, even though we're not going to say that it's Usser when he actually is with her, he's only going to be over one Isser of his brother's wife, Shalo b'makom yibum. At the end of the day, since it's hovering above us, we're going to say that he's not going to be able to do yibum, even though theoretically, in theory, he should be able to do yibum because there's only one Isser of Eishes Ach.
So I'm going to say that it's not in theory. It actually is effect, because according to that reason, if he ends up marrying her anyways. So what is the punishment then? Is it for?
Again, we said he's only going to be punished for one.
Yeah, but it should be for the second one, for the sister.
No, it should be ein isser chalal isser. He's only punished for eishes ach.
Yeah, but the eishes ach we just said no longer applies really, because he was now that the brother died, you should be able to marry her because of yibum. So that's therefore, if it's not applying anymore, then the isser of achos.
So you're arguing like your friend over here. You're teaming up against me. But at the end of the day, we're saying that it doesn't fall off because it exists and it only falls off. So it's basically the same answer, that it only would fall off if there was nothing else holding it. And it sounds like you're right. There should be yibum theoretically, but again, you can explain the Gemara like that. This other isra of achos isha, which you're not going to get punished for, is sort of like holding Eishes Ach in place, even though in theory it shouldn't be in place anymore, and it should have fallen by the side, and you should be able to marry her because Ein Isser Chal Isser. If you say Isser Chal Al Isser, then you can have two Isserim, so then there's nothing to talk about.
Right.
Then, but it's sort of like saying Isser Chal Al Isser without saying Isser Chal Isser. It's like saying both of them are here. You'll only be punished for one, but theoretically both of them are still here, and we're not going to let you be able to do Yibum.
Well, I look at it as Isser Chalal Isser, and you've got two. Look at it as sequential.
Right.
One was there, one falls off, now a second one arises separately, independently.
Because again, it was already there. Both of them were already there. When he died, they were both already there. So it's hard. Both of these Surim are there. Right, but both of these Surim are already there beforehand. But again, we're not talking about when he dies. We're talking about when the actual marriage took place, a second marriage, when Reuven got married. That's when the Isser is Chal. So we're saying the Isser is not Chal, but it's Chal. It's not Chal for punishment reasons, but it's Chal that it's going to basically strengthen the Eishes Ach connection, that'll never break, even though theoretically in a regular case it would break. That's basically what we're saying. Okay.
So is it basically a situation where we're saying it's not Shtei Istorim, but it's Ma'akev, the idea of doing evil? That's pretty much what's going on.
Right.
Yes,
right. It's not Isurim, but it's strong enough to hold Eishes Ach in place.
It's basically the Akedi.
That's right. We're basically saying in a regular case you would do Yibum here. In this case, even though you should be doing Yibum because there's really only one Isser, since there's another Isser hanging there, it's sort of pushing the Yibum off and keeping the Isser of Eishes Ach in place. So now that was Rabbi Shimon. Now we have to deal with Rabbi Yossi, because again, Rabbi Yossi said that no matter who gets married first, you have two Isurim. Rabbi Yossi said you have two Isurim. So what does that seem to imply? It means that whoever gets married first, Isser Chal Al Isser. Whether Shimon got married first, whether Reuven got married first, the second Isser of either your brother's wife or your wife's sister, that second Isser was Chal. So the Gemara says, V'savar Rabbi Yossi Isser Chal Al Isser. Is it true that Rabbi Yossi, who says that you get punished for both Eishes Ach and Achos Isha, is it true that he really holds that when you have one Isser and then another Isser comes, you're going to be punished for both Isurim? That doesn't seem to be what he holds. V'atanya avra vera sheyesh ba shtei mitos nidon b'chamura. If you do an avera that has two mitos, so you're nidon b'chamura. Now that seems to be saying that if you do two, only one is going to be chal, and if you do two, then both of them are going to be chal, isser chal al isser, and we're just going to choose the chamer one because you can only kill somebody once. But for our purposes, Rabbi Yossi Omer, nidon bezika harishona ba'alav. We don't say isser chal isser, ein isser chal al isser, and you only get the first one. What's the example? V'tanya keitzadam Rabbi Yossi nidon bezika harishona ba'alav. So chamoso v'nases eshes ish. Very interesting. So we know there's an isser of having relations with your mother-in-law. Okay. What happens if your mother-in-law was single and then she got married? Right? She had your future wife, she had your wife, and then she got married. So chamoso v'nases eshes ish nidon bechamoso. So let's just she became your mother-in-law and then she became married and then you sleep with her. So what happens? Well, what was the first isser that you had with her? Mother-in-law. What was the second isser that you had with her? That she was a married woman. So if you say Isser Chal al Isser, like we thought Rabbi Yossi would say, then it should be like the Tanakama. That what happens if you now sleep with her? You get the more Chamer one, whichever one came first. In this case, Chamoso came first. So what's the more Chamer one? The Chamer one happens to be Chamoso. Chamoso is Sreifa, and Eshes Ish is Chenek. So this exact case wouldn't be a good example, because this exact case we would say the same thing regardless of whether you hold Isser Chal al Isser or Ein Isser Chal al Isser. Because at the end of the day, whichever one came first, even if you hold Ein Isser Chal al Isser, then you get the first one. What's the first one? In this case, Chamoso. But that's not the problem. The problem is Eshes Ish V'nases Chamoso. If she's a married woman, a regular case, she's a married woman when you get married to your wife. So she's Eshes Ish. So she became usher to you before she became your mother-in-law, because she was a married woman, and before you met your wife, she was usher to you as a married woman. Then she becomes your mother-in-law. So which one should you get punished? Well, it depends. If you hold Ein Isser Chal al Isser, then when you marry her, when you marry the daughter, it doesn't matter that she now becomes your mother-in-law, because what? She's already usher to you als Eshes Ish. So if you hold Ein Isser Chal al Isser, what should you get punished when you sleep with this woman who was an Eshes Ish, who was a regular married woman who then became your mother-in-law? You should be punished for sleeping with an Eshes Ish. But over here, Eshes Ish v'natzes chamos, so nidon be'eshes Ish. So what does that prove? If you hold that, what does that mean you hold? That means you hold Ein Isser Chal al Isser. Because if you held Isser Chal al Isser, then even if she was a married woman beforehand, if you then go ahead and marry her daughter, now she becomes your mother-in-law. If Isser Chal al Isser, then she becomes your mother-in-law. Once she becomes your mother-in-law, you should get the harsher punishment of Sreifa, and you should go ahead and you should get burned. The fact that Rabbi Yossi holds that you get the first one, whichever one that is, whether it's the harsher one or not, the fact that you get the first one shows that he holds Ein Isser Chal al Isser. If he holds Ein Isser Chal al Isser, then I understand in the case of the mother-in-law why you get the first one. But over here in our case before, so then why does he hold that if Ruvain then goes ahead and is with Shimon's wife, he gets 2 Isurim? Whichever one happened first, he should be over. Either it should be Achos Isha, or it should be Eshes Ach. But why is he being chayav for both of them? Is that clear or not clear? Mm-hmm. Again, Rabbi Shimon holds that you get 2 punishments if you sleep. If Ruvain in our chart goes ahead and is with Eshes Shimon after Shimon dies, so there's 2 Isurim. There's one as his brother's wife, and one as his wife's sister. What does that mean he holds? Well, whichever one happened first, you should only be 1 Isser. Whichever one happened first, the way we explained. But the fact that there are 2 Isurim, he holds what? That Isser Chal al Isser. And the second one came and was Chal, even though there was an original Isser there. Okay, very nice. But that means that in the case of the mother-in-law, you should hold what? That you're chayav, you're always going to get what? You're always going to get sreifa. You're always going to get punished, because it doesn't matter whether she became your mother-in-law and then got married and then you slept with her, or she was married and then she became your mother-in-law and then you slept with her. Either way, Isser Chal al Isser. You should have both Isurim in place. Once you have both Isurim in place and you're killing somebody, so you should end up using the stricter one. So why is it that over here he holds you get both, with the case of Ruvain being with Eshes Shimon, and over there the case he holds that it depends and you only get the first one? So he's contradicting himself. Does he hold Isser Chal al Isser or Ein Isser Chal al Isser? So the Gemara says, don't worry, the second DAF moves quicker. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abahu, Mode Rabbi Yossi be'Isser Mosif. So he says in general, Ein Isser Chal al Isser. And therefore the case of Eshes Aish and Chamoso makes sense. Whichever one she becomes first, the other one is not Chal. And if she became an Eshes Ish first, and then she became your mother-in-law, Eina Chanami, you're only going to be punished as Eshes Ish. So then we have to explain, why is it in the case of Ruvain and Shimon, why is it that he's considering him to be chayer for both Eshes Ach and Achos Isha? Because there it's an Isser Mosif. What's an Isser Mosif, anybody?
You're talking about in terms of punishments?
An Isser Mosif means that it wasn't just another Isser. That we say, Ein Isser Chal Isser, you're right. But when this actual object, the forbidden object, becomes Usser to you, so now it's Usser to you, right? Now there's going to be another Isser. The question is basically, is that other Isser becoming Usser? Is she becoming Isser to anybody else besides for you in addition? Or is it just to you? If it's going to include a whole range of other people now, then that second Isser, he agrees, will be Chal on you as well. If she's not changing her status vis-a-vis anybody else, and it's just you, quote-unquote, changing your status, then the second Isser is not going to be Chal. So in general, he agrees. Everybody agrees, Ein Isser Chal al Isser. You have 1 Isser, the second one's not going to be Chal. There's an exception in a case where it's an Isser Mosif that he'll say you get 2 Isurim. Now what's an example of a case of an Isser Mosif? So let's go back to our chart for a second. In a case where, again, Shimon dies on the bottom. This is important to look at the chart. So we say Shimon eventually dies. So in a case where Ruvain married Eshes Reuvain, right? Reuven got married first. And then Shimon got married. So what happened when Reuven married Eshes Reuven? Eshes Shimon was usher to him because of what? When Reuven married Eshes Reuven on the bottom chart, why was Eshes Shimon usher to him? His wife's sister. Who is she usher to? Only Reuven. Only Reuven. Again, I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but simplicity is good in Yevamos. What happens when Shimon now marries Eshes Shimon? Who does she become usher to? The entire world. She was a single girl before. When Reuven married Eshes Reuven, so Eshes Shimon was mutter to the entire world except for Reuven. When Shimon marries Eshes Shimon, there is now an Isser to the entire world. Rashi says it to the brothers, but we'll keep it simple. To the entire world to marry Eshes Shimon. So now you had Eshes Shimon. She's the forbidden object. Originally, she was forbidden to only one person, Reuven. And the Isser was on Reuven to be with her. Now, this same object is having an Isser Mosif. She's having another Isser attached to her. What's that Isser? Being forbidden to the entire world. When there's an Isser Mosif, when this specific object, this forbidden object, in our case, Eshes Shimon, becomes forbidden not only to Reuven, but to the entire world, so the Isser of Eshes Ish, which is now going to apply to the entire world, will apply to Reuven as well.
If your mother-in-law gets remarried, it's the same.
What?
That's only while Shimon's alive.
It doesn't matter. The Isser is being Chal while Shimon's alive.
Right, but as soon as Shimon dies...
Again, you're back to your original... You're attacking me. We already went through this. L'maisa, the Isser was Chal at the time. The problem that the Gemara is going to ask, and the reason we're going to have to reject this, is because what? He said that both Isurim are Chal, and he did not make a difference between who got married first. This only works... This whole svara only works where Reuven got married first. Eshes Shimon is married to Eshes Shimon is usher to Reuven only. When Shimon marries Eshes Shimon, all of a sudden now Eshes Shimon becomes usher to the entire world. That isser can be chal on Reuven as well as Eshes Ach. Good.
The equivalent case is your mother-in-law gets remarried.
Okay. But again, the mother-in-law case doesn't. The mother-in-law case doesn't matter because ein isser chal al isser.
No, mother-in-law gets remarried. Now she's usher to the whole world before she.
Right, but I'm saying regardless, in that case, it wouldn't matter because she's going to get the stricter one anyway.
Oh, right.
So, but the difference, and the reason the Gemara is going to reject this. 1 second. Let's see. You had enough time to talk today. What happens? We're running out of time. What happens if Shimon? We got to take that off the tape. That's the president of the shul. What happens?
Now you have to take it off.
Now I have to take it off the tape. I shouldn't have said that. You're right. The ex-president. Sorry. Okay. I'm not going to tell you which president. Everybody here has been the president of the shul at some point. So what happens if Shimon marries first? Nobody watches YouTube anyway. Come on. What happens if Shimon gets married first? So what happens if Shimon married? What happens if Shimon married Eshes Shimon first? Well, Eshes Shimon was now usher to who? To the entire world. Right. What happens when Reuven marries Eshes Reuven? So now, theoretically, Eshes Shimon's not being forbidden to anybody else. Eshes Shimon's already forbidden to Reuven. So since there's no additional Isser being Chal on the forbidden object, i.e. Eshes Shimon, by Reuven marrying Eshes Reuven, her sister, then the Isser, which should apply only to Reuven, is not going to come and apply to Reuven as well. So he would agree that in that case, which is called an Isser Kolel, he would agree that the Isser is not Chal. The problem is that in the Mishnah, he holds that you get two Isurim regardless of who gets married first. And that's how the Gemara rejects its answer. The Gemara thinks, he holds Ein Isser Chal Isser, you're right, you only always get one. But at the end of the day, we see over here that you get two when it's an Isser Mosif, but you're right. But only one of the two possible cases in the Mishnah, are an Isser Mosif. The other one is not an Isser Mosif. When Reuven marries first, that's an Isser Mosif. But if Shimon got married first, then it's not an Isser Mosif. And why does Rabbi Yossi yet he holds in our Mishnah that both of them are Chal, even when it's not an Isser Mosif?
It adds something. It was the Tsar involved.
What?
If you had a Tsar involved, then it would
make it more complicated, right?
Then you would add more. Then it would be something extra.
Right. Then it would be something extra. Right. So that's what the Gemara says. Rabbi Abba mod Rabbi Yossi b'Isser Mosif. Rabbi Abba, who says that Rabbi Yossi holds Ein Isser Chal al Isser, you're right. And he agrees, ain't Isser Chalal Isser, and that's why in the case of Chamoso and Eshes Ish, you get the first one. Why in our Mishnah did he hold that you get both when Reuven marries Eshes Shimon after Shimon dies? Because it's an Isser Mosif. So the Gemara says, no. You try pulling a fast one on me. That's true when Reuven got married first, because now Eshes Shimon was first only usher to him. Migo di Sosef Isser Lagabe Achimi Tosef Isser Lagabe Didei. And now when Eshes Shimon gets married to Shimon, she's not only usher to Reuven, she's married to all of Shimon's other brothers and to the entire world. Elahecha de Nasa Meis V'Achakach Nasa Chai. But when Shimon got married first and then Reuven got married, my Isser Mosevika. There's no Isser Mosiv because she was usher to the entire world, including Reuven, as soon as she married Shimon. And now that Reuven marries her sister, it doesn't include anything. It's not an Isser Mosiv on her. Again, Isser Mosiv is on the object, the forbidden object. Nothing becomes more forbidden about her. She's forbidden to everybody in the world. She can't become more forbidden than everybody in the entire world. As opposed to when she's forbidden only to Reuven, and now she becomes forbidden to the entire world, so that Isser will be Chal as well. And if you're going to argue, well, what do you mean? Now Reuven becomes usher to all of the other sisters, etc. Hi Isser Kolalhu. That's not our discussion. That'll be our discussion tomorrow. But again, for our purposes, this is not an Isser Mosif. It's only an Isser Mosif in one of the two cases. But yeah, Rabbi Yossi seems to have a rule across the board that whichever way it happens, he gets both punishments. Isser Chalal Isser. So it can't be because of an Isser Mosif. So again, if Rabbi Yossi holds ein Isser Chalal Isser, then the case of the mother-in-law is fine. But then why does he hold that in our case of Ba'alah, why is he chayiv? Because of both. He should just be chayiv because of one, whichever one happened first. So the Gemara answers, you're right. Ella Amar Rava, you're right. He always holds ein Isser Chalal Isser. So again, why is he chayiv for both? He's not chayiv for both. Male aniyalav ki'ilu asa shtayim ve'eno chayiv ela achas. He's only chayiv for one. He's only chayiv for whichever one came first. He's chayiv if he got married first, then he's chayiv for his wife's sister. If his brother got married first, Reuven, then he's chayiv if he's with her for what? For his brother's wife. So why does it tell me that you're chayiv both? It doesn't mean you're chayiv both. It means that it says if you did both. Okay, what's the nafkamina? It's if you're not chayiv both, what does it mean? It's as if you did both. My nafkamina, who cares? Okay, very nice. I'll sin all day if you're only going to tell me that I'm going to be chayiv for one. Even though we're not going to punish him in this world for both, whatever the misa he deserves, or whatever punishment he deserves in this world for both, he's going to be buried amongst the Rishayim Gemurim. And again, there's Machlokes Rashi and Tosfos, but again, it's going to count as two sins, but he's not going to be punished for two sins. So basically what he's saying is, there's a difference. Ein Isser Chalal Isser. Everybody agrees that a second Isser is not going to be Chal. Whichever one you did first, that's the one you're punished for in this world. However, don't think that you're going to get off scot-free. It's still going to go on your tab, and when the time comes to bury you, and we're adding up, again, it's a little bit complicated to understand, but when we're adding up all of your Chatayim, we're going to count it as a Chait, even though you didn't get punished for it. Okay?
So it was by accident he brings...
Again, so Rashi has a whole discussion about if it was by accident. Avalim hayashogeg haya chayav beis chatos by Isser Mosif. No, that's by Isser Mosif. Okay, so let's go. We have 5 more minutes, and the rest of the Gemara is pretty easy, and then we'll discuss all of these cases that we're about to discuss now. We're going to discuss on the next DAF tomorrow. So ubeplukta, this is a separate discussion. Now we have 3 interesting cases. De itmar, zar sheshimesh b'Shabbos. If you have a non-Kohen who does the avoda on Shabbos, well, what's the issue of a non-Kohen doing the avoda? Well, a non-Kohen can never do the avoda. And in general, the question is, can we do the avoda on Shabbos? Well, we're allowed to do certain avodas on Shabbos. So Rabbi Chia Amar Chayiv Shtayim Bar Kafra Mer Ein Chayiv Elachas. In all of these cases, Rabbi Chia is going to say you're Chayiv too, and this is not a matter of Isser Chalal Isser. Again, this is an Isser where it's 2 totally separate Isurim. There's an Isser that he's a Zar, and there's an Isser that you can't do the Avodah on Shabbos. This is a separate case than the one we've been discussing the whole time, was a case where a second Isser is Kam and Chal afterwards. This is a case where when you're non-Kohen, you're also to do it, and in Shabbos, it's also to do the Avodah. So Rabbi Chia Omer Chayiv Shtayim, Bar Kafra Mer Ein Chiyuv Ela Achas. So Kafratz Rabbi Chia V'Nishba Avodah Kach Shemati Rabbi Shtayim. Rabbi Chia yells, basically this is the way of the Gemara selling, gets up and yells and says, I swear I heard from Rabbi, you get 2 Isurim if you're a non-Kohen and you do the Avodah on Shabbos. Kafratz Bar Kafra V'Nishba Avodah Kach Shemati Rabbi Achas. He swears, I heard from Rabbi, you only get 1 Isser. So again, it's interesting that they heard from Rabbi at different times, or they misheard what Rabbi said. That's an interesting discussion as well. So let's see. Rabbi Chia Ladun. So Rabbi Chia is going to explain why does a Zar who does the Avodah on Shabbos get 2 Isurim. Shabbos l'chol nesra. It's usher to do avodah on Shabbos for everybody. Kishehutra b'mikdash. You can't do malacha on Shabbos. When we said you can do malacha on Shabbos, that was only b'mikdash. But who was that mutter for? It wasn't that we have a blanket statement that anybody can do malacha in the base of mikdash on Shabbos. Aizel kohanim hutra. Only kohanim. L'kohanim hutra v'lo l'zarim. Therefore what? Therefore he's still usher to do the avodah because he's a zar, and he's still usher to do the avodah because you're not allowed to do avodah on Shabbos unless you're Kohen when we gave you permission to do the avodah on Shabbos. And therefore yesh kamishum zaros v'yesh kamishum Shabbos. When he does the avodah on Shabbos, he's chayav 2 times, one for being a non-Kohen and one for doing malacha on Shabbos, because he was never given permission. Only Kohanim were given permission to do malacha on Shabbos. Hitchil Arkaf are allowed to know. Shabbos la kol nesra. Nobody's allowed to do malacha on Shabbos. Kishehutra b'mikdash. When we said you're allowed to do malacha in the mikdash, hutra for everybody. That means anybody can do malacha. Now, Eina Chanami, the Zar has a separate reason why he can't do malacha, but when God said malacha can be done, certain malachas can be done in the mikdash on Shabbos, that was across the board for anybody. Now, it happens to be that you got to have your pass that says Kohen. But once you're in the mikdash, it's mutter to do malacha, certain malachas on Shabbos. Ein kan el zaris. So it's only a problem of zaris, because again, they're arguing whether when there was a heter, basically the machlokas, so the machlokas is, once there was a heter to do malacha in the base of mikdash on Shabbos, does that preclude anybody, or is that a blanket heter for everybody? It just happens to be, logistically, you need to have a pass that says I'm a Kohen. That's that case. Baal mum sheshimesh betuma, similar case. You have a Kohen who's a baal mum. Now, as a baal mum, you're not allowed to do the avoda, and sheshimesh betuma. You're also not allowed to do the avoda when you're tamei. So theoretically, you should be over for 2 things. Rabbi Chia omer chayev shtayim bar kafar merin chayev elacha. Same thing. Kafar Rabbi Chia v'nish ba'avoda kach shemati Rabbi shtayim. I heard 2. Kavatz bar kafar v'nish ba'avoda kach shemati Rabbi achas. Hilchei Rabbi Chia ladun. So Rabbi Chia tries to explain why you chayev 2. Tuma l'kol nesra. It's usher for anybody to do the avoda in tuma. Kishehutra b'mikdash. Now the Gemara tells us, and Rashi says that there are certain times when you can actually do the avoda tuma, when most of the kohanim are tamei, and you can't find somebody else to do it, and it's a korban tzibor, it's a public offering like a korban tamid, then there was a heter to do it bituma, for the kohen to do it bituma. So when we allowed this, it's going to be the same exact logic. When we allowed you to do in certain cases the avoda bitame, just like we allowed certain cases to do it on Shabbos, certain avodas, so when we allowed the avoda to be done in the mikdash even when people are tamei, aizel kohanim tmima hutru. That was only for a kohen who's not a baal mum. He can do the avoda bituma if there's nobody else. Kohanim tmimim hutru v'lo bali mumin. Yesh kamishum bali mum, yesh kamishum tuma. But that didn't include a non. That was only for a specific case of a kohen who's a perfect non-baal mum kohen. But if you do it as a baal mum, so you have the isra of being a baal mum, and you were never given permission to do the avoda bituma, and therefore you're doing the avoda bituma as well. Hilchel bar kafar ladu, no. Tuma la kol nesra. Nobody can do the avoda betuma. Kishehutra b'mikdash, when we said that there are certain cases where you could do the avoda b'mikdash betuma, hutra, it was a blanket heter. The only problem is what? You got to be able to get in and do it. If you don't have the pass that says that you're perfect, if you're a baal mum, then you don't have the pass. If you don't have the pass, that's only a problem of the pass. But once you have the pass, quote unquote, once you can get into the mikdash, so now we basically have a blanket statement. Anybody can do the avoda bituma even. Ein kan ela mishum baal mum. Same exact case. Finally, we'll finish with this. Zar she'acha malika. Very fascinating case. We know that there's a zar, so a zar can't eat. He can't eat stuff that's meant for the kohanim. He also has to do shchita on any bird. Now there's a malika in the Beis HaMikdash that for certain types of shachting with a bird, so they would do a special malika for the avoda, then they would throw the blood, and for the korban chatas they could actually eat it. So the question is, now the zar eats from a malika. So what's the problem? First of all, he's a zar, so he can't eat stuff that's meant for a kohen. And the question is the malika, is that procedure acceptable only for kohanim to eat? But for anybody else, what would it be considered? A nevela? Or once we let you do malika, so it's considered to be shechted, and now when he eats it, it's only a problem that he's eating it as a non-kohen. So Rabbi Chia omer chayev shtayim bar kafar merin chayev elachas. Kafar Rabbi Chia v'nish ba'avoda kach shemati Rabbi shtayim. Kafar bar kafar v'nish ba'avoda kach shemati Rabbi achas. Hitchi Rabbi Chia ladun. Why is he going to be chayev to nevela la kol nesra? You have to shecht an animal in order to eat it. Kishehutra b'mikdash eitz akanim hutra. When we allowed you to eat an animal which was not shechted in the regular way, but was only shechted with malika, we only allowed kohanim to eat that. Kohanim hutra v'lo lezarim. But we don't let zarim eat it. So yesh kamishum zaris for yesh kamishum malika. So when you go ahead and eat it as a zar, so you're eating it as a non-kohen. And second of all, you're eating an animal that wasn't shechted properly, because it was only shechted properly vis-a-vis the kohanim. Hirchel bar Krafaladu, no. Nevela la kol nesra. A nevela is also to everybody. Kishehutra b'mikdash hutra. When they said that you can do malika on a bird for certain types of sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash, you can do the malika and then you can eat it. That means once you can get into the Beis HaMikdash, you're allowed to eat any food here that's been shachted with malika. Problem is what? You don't have the pass of being able to eat it with because you're a zar. So ein kan ela mishum zar. So if you go ahead and eat it, so theoretically it's been shechted and it's no longer nevela because again it was hutra in the mikdash as a good shechting. Problem is that when you eat it, you're going to be chayav out eating it as a zar.